earth, fire, wind, water, and heart.
By your powers combined, this is the Elemental Adept feat in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Greetings, Elementalists. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes.
And today we're taking a look at the Elemental Adept feat in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
This is a great feat for many spellcasters to consider. So we're going to look at the rules and benefits of the feat, as well as consider some role-playing ideas for characters that might want to take it, and really look into this question of, is it a feat worth considering?
I've played a character that used this feat before, and there are some features that are really, really cool, but also depending on the damage type, the elemental type that you choose, there may be some problems.
Yeah, we've run the numbers and looked at the number of spells of each elemental type available in the player's handbook and Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and compared that against the monsters that are resistant or immune to those damage types. And we've come to some interesting conclusions, so we're really interested to hear your thoughts on whether or not this is a worthwhile feat or some alternative strategies are a better approach.
So, let's get rolling.
Elemental Adept is a feat, which means that you can select it instead of taking an ability score increase whenever your class grants you one.
Now, this feat has a prerequisite, and that is that you have to be able to cast at least one spell.
This is a feat that you can take multiple times, and each time that you choose the feat, you choose one of the following 5 damage types: acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder. The feat only works with these 5 damage types, which are not actually all the damage types available to spellcasters.
Spells you cast ignore resistance to damage of the chosen type.
In addition, when you roll damage for a spell you cast that deals damage of that type, you treat any 1 on the damage die as a 2 instead. So the first benefit of the feat allows you to bypass the resistance that some monsters and creatures might have to spells that you choose. So probably when you choose this feat, you're going to choose a damage type that you have a lot of spells in your repertoire to cast.
But then you also want to think about how many monsters are resistant to that spell, but also how many are immune to that spell. This feat will not be able to bypass immunity.
And that's a really key distinction. It might help you defeat the fire resistance of certain demons, but red dragons and fire elementals are still going to be immune to your fireball's damage. And that can be a really big pitfall, especially depending on what types of monsters your dungeon master commonly throws up against you. And of course, you might spend the entire campaign not battling against monsters that have these resistances, and that part of the feat then doesn't even matter.
The second part of the feat, which is my favorite part, is that when you roll damage of that elemental type, you can make any 1 into a 2.
This was actually a little bit of a disappointment for us, because the first time we read the feat, we thought it let you re-roll the 1 entirely. So if you rolled a 1 on your fireball, you could re-roll that and turn it into a 6.
And you let me get away with that for a long time, which made me think that I was the most powerful spellcaster in the world, because my fireball was just all re-rolled 1s. But it doesn't quite work that way. It just turns them into a 2.
My hypothesis is that it doesn't break the game to change that rule. Because I think that looking overall at the number of creatures, we're going to kind of go in the next section and look at the number of spells of each damage type and the number of monsters that are resistant or immune to those damage types. And I actually think that the bypassing the resistances of monsters is pretty weak as a feature. Except in very specific cases, and that getting that extra damage makes the feat feel like it's actually doing something.
Yeah, now bumping a 1 up to a 2 can still be nice because everybody hates rolling 1s, but I definitely felt like a powerful elemental adept when I was turning those 1s into something far more powerful.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the better class features when the sorcerers have empowered spell that lets them re-roll the damage, and that's one of my favorite meta magics. So being able to get a taste of this as a wizard with a feat is kind of useful. Maybe that's kind of the imbalancing part about it, is that it steps on the sorcerer's unique thing. If we're going to consider this feat, we can choose acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage. So which one should we choose?
Well, from our look at them, there's really only 2 that stood out as a viable option. The rest of them kind of didn't have enough going for them to really stand out.
Yeah, and here's what we found. We pulled up on D&D Beyond the spell list, and we tried to filter them out by the number of spells that appeared in both the player's handbook and Xanathar's Guide to Everything of each elemental type. And then we compared that against the number of monsters in the monster manual that were resistant or immune. And here's what we found. So the first damage type that you can choose is Acid, which really doesn't give you a lot of options.
Yeah, there's only one cantrip and 2 spells that actually do acid damage.
Yeah, so unless you like Vitriolic Sphere and Acid Splash, you don't get a lot out of this feat from Acid. Especially because there's only 18 monsters in the monster manual that are resistant to Acid. And there's 15 that are immune. But really, overall, there's such a small pool of spells and such a small pool of monsters that I think you'd just be better off served by choosing a different spell if you're going to be in the sewers fighting acid monsters. Cold damage, on the other hand, is much more promising. We've got 2 great cantrips to start us off with, Frostbite and Ray of Frost.
And then there's a whole array of really powerful spells here that do cold damage.
Yeah, you've got Ice Storm, Cone of Cold, Wall of Ice, and even low-level spells in Xanathars like Ice Knife and Snowball Storm.
And then there's also this large array of enemies who have resistance to cold damage.
Yeah, actually, cold is the most resisted damage type in the monster manual, with 47 monsters resistant to cold damage.
So yeah, with such a nice list of spells and that many creatures that you'll be able to forego their resistance, it actually works really well with a cold-themed spellcaster.
There's actually only 20 monsters as well that are outright immune to cold damage. So cold is one of those areas where I think there's enough spells to build an elementalist around across all the levels. You're basically going to get one spell of every level, and you'll probably want to round that out with one other damage type. But I think you could probably make it work really, really well with cold damage.
The next damage type, and my personal favorite, is fire. But there is something very important about fire. Although it has an incredible spell list, with the most spells available to you, it also has the most immune creatures.
Yeah, this is a big issue, I think, for fire damage, because the spell list for fire damage is phenomenal. You have Firebolt, Green Flame Blade in the cantrips, and I think we counted 13 spells.
Yeah, things like Fireball, Meteor Swarm, like there's...
Even low-level stuff like Burning Hand, Scorching Ray, Wall of Fire. There's almost a fire spell for every single spell level, which really gives you the thematic feeling of being a pyromancer, because you always have an option.
Yeah, so this might be the most viable option because you say, hey, I can get the most out of my damage rolls with these spells by changing those 1s to 2s, things like that. But with the amount of creatures that are immune to fire, it does become a little problematic at times.
37 monsters in the monster manual resist fire damage, and 40 are immune. And these include monsters like demons and devils, and a huge range of creatures across many different creature types, including iconic creatures like red dragons and fire giants, which can really be a bit of an issue because many campaigns will have a red dragon of some kind in them, and it really sucks when your entire arsenal is completely shut down against the big boss.
I will say that playing a pyromancer who is well equipped with these fire spells is still a very satisfying build with the elemental adept, because in general, fire-based spells do the most raw damage of any spells in the game.
Yeah, you get to feel like you're blowing up the world, and if most of what you're fighting are zombies, ogres, orcs, and particularly trolls, because fire is also the damage type where there's the most monsters with a vulnerability to fire damage, incidentally.
So there's that. But that doesn't really help with elemental adept.
Exactly. It just gives you a good spell choice. Yeah. Moving on to lightning damage. This is another very small category. Smaller than you'd think.
Yeah, so we only have 2 cantrips and 4 to 5 spells that do lightning damage.
Shocking Grasp and Lightning Lure. And then you have spells like Lightning Bolt, Witch Bolt, Chain Lightning, and Storm Sphere doing lightning damage.
Yeah, so not a big array to choose from.
Kind of disappointing because lightning is such a fun element. Like the crackling lightning shooting everywhere. There's a small selection of lightning damage spells, but there's almost as many creatures resistant to lightning damage as there are fire damage. There's 35 creatures resistant to lightning, but only 10 that are outright immune. So lightning's kind of like that good fallback for your pyromancer, actually.
Yeah, if you have some backup lightning spells and you do want to take Elemental Adept Lightning, you're going to forego so many creatures that have resistance. So that's a really good bonus.
Yeah. And finally, we have Thunder Damage, which only has a few spells, but they're good ones.
Their list of spells are all some of my favorite spells in the game, but there's just so few of them.
Yeah, there's Thunderwave, Shatter, and the wonderful, wonderful Thunderstep.
I love Thunderstep.
Yeah, but that's pretty much it.
There's only 14 creatures that are resistant to thunder damage, and there's 2 that are immune.
So great spells, but not really a necessity to have this feat to amp it up. Again, Thunder's kind of one of those damage types that I would fall back to. Now, of course, there's also a whole bunch of spells that are multi-type. Spells like Dragon Breath, Chromatic Orb, and many, many other elemental spells allow you to choose different elements when you cast the spell, and these still apply regardless of which of the damage types you select. You can always throw a lightning-based Chromatic Orb to round out your list, or choose Dragon Breath for cold to kind of bulk that out. And there are a few spells that do multiple damage types at the same time, which then that part of the spell would be affected by Elemental Adept.
So the big question then is Elemental Adept better to take than, say, just picking a wide variety of different spell types?
I think if you're being a raw tactician about it and you want to kind of sort of minimize the number of spells that you're resistant to and maximize the best spells, I think choosing a smorgasbord of well-selected spells when you're building a wizard or sorcerer, choosing a variety of damage types is probably the best way to go. And really, you don't need that much. Like, I think that if you take Fireball and one other spell of another damage type, you're kind of going to have your bases covered, because there's very few creatures that are outright immune to both fire and cold, or cold and lightning at the same time. So if you got 2 specializations, you're kind of okay.
At the same time, if you do want to play a very specialized class, I'm thinking back to my first character, who I just basically was picking all the fire spells. So picking Elemental Adept just gave me that little bit of extra edge in moments where my character would have only been doing half damage. I was doing more damage and re-rolling the ones based on our house roll. But even if those ones had just been 2s, it just gives me that extra little edge to feel more like the powerful pyromancer.
There's definitely times where if you didn't have the feat, you would have missed it if you didn't have it, and it's that feat that's like, oh man, I really, really wish that I had it. At the same time, when you're the dungeon master, you kind of have to be honest with your player, and if they're considering taking this feat, like, tell them if it's not going to be worth it. Like, if you're not planning on using monsters that have elemental resistances, or monsters that have immunity, and the player is building a pyromancer, it's worthwhile to throw a curveball at them once, but completely, like, shutting them down is not really going to create a memorable or positive play experience for that player. I also think that, like, Elemental Adept just speaks to this really great role-playing trope of playing the elementally attuned character, right? Like, it's built into the draconic bloodline sorcerer to choose the elemental affinity associated with your dragon ancestry.
It's almost like the Last Airbender, or like things like that, the Planeteers from Captain Planet, just like people who summon those elemental powers to really do the damage, and to be the adept, the elemental adept, just kind of helps you hone in on that role-playing idea.
Yeah, so I think that if I was playing a draconic sorcerer that had one of these draconic bloodlines, I think elemental adept is just a logical and thematic choice for your character in general. I think that also you could do really well taking elemental adept for fire, say if you were a cleric of the light domain, because you get a lot of fire spells there.
Yeah.
And maybe even certain druid, like if you were, I could see a Circle of the Land druid that was really trying to build a blaster character, build up around that. But I think with a wizard, I probably wouldn't take this feat.
Interesting. That is what I did.
But just because a wizard has the flexibility with your spell selection, like because the wizard can change their spells in and out in a way that the other spellcasters really can't, I think that the wizard doesn't necessarily, even the evocation wizard, because you're not locked in with a single element with that subclass, you can spread out and make sure that you always have the right answer.
And generally speaking, you want that large variety of spell damage types anyway, so that you can handle multiple types of situations.
Yeah, and I think the other ones, the other spellcasters like bards and rangers and paladins probably don't have enough access to those elemental spells to make them worthwhile. I think with a bard, I would probably just load up on Synaptic Static and Dissonant Whispers and just go all out for the psychic damage, which Elemental Adept doesn't even apply to.
Yeah, one thing that I find really disappointing just about the spell lists in general when we look at this episode is there's not a lot of great acid spells, thunder spells. These are damage types that I really wish and hope to see more of in the future. I love the idea of like spewing acid damage out. And I just wish that there was more of that.
Yeah, and I could see there being... I'm surprised that there isn't a feat already in 5th edition that lets you change the damage type of your spells.
I would love to cast Fireball as an acid spell.
Or, like, make Lightning Bolt into a fire spell, like a Gout of Flame. Or change those around. There used to be spells that did that, or like or feats that did that in like 3rd edition D&D. So I could see homebrewing new versions of those feats that let either players change half the damage of the spell to a different damage type, or even mutate them entirely, or even just homebrew new versions of spells based on existing ones of a different damage type. That's something that I do all the time as a DM for my villains. Like, I definitely have made villains that can throw a lightning ball, or have made villains that instead of having it be chain lightning, it did necrotic damage in a chain.
So this has been our guide to the Elemental Adept feat in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We hope that you feel empowered by the elements.
And of course, we would love to know if you think that this is a worthwhile feat, or if you're considering some other homebrew solutions or some of the ideas that we talked about in this episode. Let us know in the comments below.
And if you need to know more about how spells and spellcasting works, you can check out our video on that right up over here.
And we got a whole playlist about other feats in D&D 5e, including Warcaster, right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.